What's the state of New Orleans on the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina? Gary Rivlin will tell us about his new book, Katrina After the Flood.
We all have this sense of let the good times roll in New Orleans, black, white together, parading, and that's true. But there was a lot of tensions in Party City leading up to Katrina. There's very much a black-white split, and that just got worse, I believe, with an unequal recovery.
Is police reform possible? Joe Domanick will be here to talk about his new book, Blue, the LAPD and the Battle to Redeem American Policing.
Let's do what needs to be done to reduce crime. We're not any longer going to just be responders to crime. We're going to prevent crime.
Alexandra Alter will fill us in on the latest from the literary world. Greg Cowles has bestseller news. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Gary Rivlin is here now to talk about his new book, Katrina After the Flood. Hi, Gary.
Hi.
So you reported on Katrina for The Times. Were you based in New Orleans at that time, or how did you come to cover?
Well, at first it was really hard to be in New Orleans. When I arrived, it was 80% underwater. We had a couple of hotel rooms. The Times had a couple of hotel rooms at one of the two hotels, if I'm remembering right, that were open. And we just used Baton Rouge, the capital, 70 miles away, as home base. And we took turns going into New Orleans and using the few rooms that we had. It's funny, by the way. In Baton Rouge, it was a former plantation, a place that did weddings and events that literally had the old slave quarters still on, at least some of them. And the Times just booked it indefinitely. Every once in a while, there'd be a pre-booked wedding, and we'd all have to sort of clear away. But they just set up a bureau in this old plantation house. And at one point, there's probably like 20 of us staying there.
So you arrived after the storm. You were you were on what's called the national desk here, and they sent you down to New Orleans to report after Katrina hit?
Yeah, I was on the business desk in San Francisco covering Silicon Valley at the time. I arrived the week after, but I was actually brought there to cover a single business hit hard by the storm and chronicle their struggle to recover. In fact,
what business was that?
Liberty Bank and Alden McDonald. One of the main characters in my book. There's probably more words about Alden McDonald than Liberty Bank. I met him 11 days after the storm and just kept in touch with him, seeing him every week. And then, as time went on, it was more every month and then every few months kind of thing. I had given up his bank for dead. I mean, 7 of their 8 branches were destroyed by flooding and or looters. Their headquarters, 80% of their customer base had been drowned out. And I called my editor and said, if we do this, we have to be prepared that the FDIC, the federal regulators, are going to come in and shut them down. And it was amazing. A year later, they were profitable, and now they're the 4th largest black-owned bank in the country. But, slowly, it was interesting. Ray Nagin, the mayor at the time, was from the business community. So all the people he was turning to help him come up with a rebuilding plan were business people. And I was on the business desk at the time trying to find businesses. And so basically everyone he was turning to for help were the people I was meeting to try to figure out what my story would be. And so within a month, they moved me to the national desk because suddenly I had all these sources just by dumb luck in a way.
So giving that one anecdote about Liberty paints a very rosy picture of the recovery. But I'm assuming that doesn't tell the full story of Katrina's impact on the city.
Back when, 10 years ago when the disaster occurred, there was a sense of it was, an equal opportunity disaster, that black and white, rich and poor didn't make a difference. You were hit. And, yes, there was one significant white community, prosperous white community that was hit hard. A suburban community was flooded. But you were more than 3 times more likely to get flooded if you were a black homeowner versus a white homeowner. And the same kind of, just like it wasn't an equal opportunity storm, it has not been an equal opportunity recovery. 10 years later, New Orleans, a city of 455,000 at the time of Katrina, there's still 100,000 less black people in New Orleans today than 10 years ago.
Is there a comparable figure for the white population?
There's been a fall in the number of whites. The city has 20% less people. There's a lot of newcomers. There's 50,000 or so people who didn't live in New Orleans prior who have now moved to New Orleans.
This is not former residents moving back, but
right, exactly.
Completely new people.
Exactly. But, you drive around. It's funny, as a tourist, in other words, before Katrina, I spent all my time, of course, uptown, the Garden District, Warehouse District, the French Quarter. But, reporting this book for the last few years, I've been on the other half of the city, and it's still 10 years later pretty stark. There's the lower Ninth Ward, which was, decimated by Katrina. It's only 36% of the population is back 10 years later. It looks like the disaster happened 3 months ago, not 10 years ago. But even black middle class, black professional class communities, 60% back, 70% back, maybe 80% back. If you're talking about a really well-off community, and it's the recovery is not over despite 10 years.
You mentioned a wealthy white community that was hit hard. Was that Lakeview?
Lakeview, yeah.
So Lakeview is actually lower, right, compared with sea level than the lower Ninth Ward.
The poor lower Ninth Ward, the name, like lower Manhattan, it's geography, it's not elevation. The lower Ninth, there used to be a Ninth Ward, and there was a man-made canal built in the 1920s, so then there became an upper Ninth Ward and a lower Ninth Ward. But everyone, including Ray Nagin, the mayor at the time, assumed it was the lowest lying land in New Orleans, in the big debate back then. And those months after Katrina, it's like, we don't have unlimited money here, folks. Do we want to rebuild the lower Ninth Ward? As the mayor said, we shouldn't rebuild the lower Ninth Ward because it's the lowest lying land. So the lower Ninth Ward, which was geographically just at the worst spot, it happened to be where the storm surge hit the hardest. Not only did they have to deal with the water, then they had to deal with all these misperceptions. People were writing the place off based on myth, based on the wrong assumptions. The school said, no, we're not building schools in the lower Ninth Ward. We don't think it's ever going to come back. And so as slow as the recovery was all around the city, it was much slower there. It was the last place to have electricity, last place to have running water, last place where they allowed trailers.
How does that rebuilding effort in the lower Ninth Ward compare with the rebuilding effort in Lakeview?
It starts the same. People in Lakeview days... This
is the white affluent neighborhood.
Right. People in Lakeview days, within a few months, they started meeting in their rec community. I mean, Lakeview, 8 feet, under 10 feet of water, it was decimated too. The whole thing, 8,000, 7,000 homes, all underwater. But, they started meeting in a church rec room and, putting up a map and put a pin if you want to come back, just trying to get everyone excited and, believing that we could be pioneers and do this. Because, meanwhile, the city's trying to make up its mind, do we have the money to put services out there, garbage pickup, police, fire? In Lakeview, they have this attitude like, you see, we didn't wait on government. The people in the lower Ninth Ward, other parts of the city, they wait on government. It's not true. I mean, the lower Ninth Ward, same exact story. February, so 5-6 months after Katrina, they started meeting in a community center there. Same idea. They put a map, and it wasn't pins. They had Post-its. Write down your address, and if you intend on coming back. And they weren't waiting for government either. The difference is that Lakeview, I mean, it's a professional class. It's not a rich neighborhood. It's a professional class neighborhood. There's more wealth there. There's more family wealth. There's more, the individual homeowners had wealth. That's not true of the lower Ninth Ward. The lower Ninth Ward was very working class, chambermaids and kitchen help, a lot of retirees, very old communities. And the second thing is the inadvertent policy decision made behind this thing called Road Home. Road Home, $10 billion, the largest federal recovery program in history, seemed like a really good idea. Like, okay, there's the assessed value of your home. There's the insurance you get. We're going to make up the difference to up to $150,000. So you have a $350,000 home. Insurance gave you $250,000. You're going to get a road home check for $100,000. The problem with that is it's not based on the cost of rebuilding. It's based on the assessed value of your home. And homes in white communities are worth more than the same home in a black community. It's same home, but just the appraised value is much higher. So what you saw happening in the lower Ninth Ward, where a typical home would be $60,000, $70,000, even if they had flood insurance, which they weren't required to have, or much of the lower Ninth wasn't required to have, Road Home would say, oh, okay, so we'll get $30,000 in flood insurance. Here's $40,000 check to bring you up to $70,000. Well, you couldn't rebuild the 1,200 square foot home for that kind of money. It's about $100 a square foot in New Orleans. Sheetrock costs what sheetrock costs. Contractors charge what contractors charge. And so what you saw happening in the lower Ninth Ward and all around the black community, because of this flaw in Road Home, is people didn't have enough money to rebuild. By 2010, 5 years after a storm, a federal judge ruled in favor of plaintiffs who said that was a racially discriminatory policy. But by that point, there was under $500 million left. The Obama administration kicked in a little bit of extra money, but it was too late.
Anniversaries are obviously a convenient time to look back on a news event. Right now, we're looking back 1 year on Ferguson. We did the same thing with Katrina a year later and 5 years later. 10 years out now, obviously another major milestone. But what is it that people don't understand or don't know? What stories after that story haven't yet been told that you wanted to tell in this book?
I really feel like the main point would be the unequal recovery. What people are going to be hearing a lot about, I believe, in the coming weeks as every media outlet does their Katrina 10th anniversary story, is the New Orleans miracle. New Orleans is back. That's what the mayor's perspective is, and based on the early media, that seems going to be the
That's the narrative.
That's the narrative. The resiliency of the people, and of course it's true. And by the way, New Orleans does look better in many ways. I mean, you have a flood and buildings are ruined, libraries, old theaters, that kind of stuff. Well, there's a lot of that place is new, right? I mean, everything's been refurbished and it's really sparkling, and there's a real Brooklyn-like young energy there. A lot of people have flocked there, tens of thousands of newcomers.
Are these newcomers sort of young college graduates, sort of entrepreneurial types?
Exactly. So entrepreneurialism is up. There's 20% less people, but there are more restaurants. Neighborhoods are being remade. There's a real good energy there. The Central Business District seems in very, very good shape. It's just the other half of the story. I call it the half a miracle. It's like, but go to the eastern half of the city where, the largely black part of town, and it's a very different story. The mayor has declared the recovery is over, and I'm just thinking, if I'm in the 7th Ward, a black working class neighborhood, and my neighborhood's only 2/3 back, 70% back. What am I thinking? Like, oh, I guess this is done. I'm getting no more help. This is now my new reality. And so, I really think there are two narratives here. There's, for lack of a better term, the white narrative, the resiliency narrative, and there's the black narrative, and they're both true. But I really feel like both need to be laid out, and it's not just this simple like, oh my God, New Orleans is back better than ever.
Right. I mean, economic disparity and racial disparity was rampant in New Orleans before Katrina hit. Has it, though, exacerbated those problems?
Well, there was a real effort to make sure that the poor people didn't come back. I mean, there was a coterie of people who put a lot of time and energy into that. I'll also point out FEMA, they give you a one-way ticket. The 50,000 or so people who were rescued from the flooded city, the story we all watched on cable news, they were put up at hotels for months and months, or in FEMA camps, trailer camps, but there was no one to help them back. You're middle class, you take out your credit card, you fly back, and you can do it. But a lot of people making $15,000 a year, the working poor, didn't have any help going back. But the thing I learned about a disaster is that the problems your city had at the time of the disaster are the challenges that are going to thwart your efforts to recover. So it's poor schools, the dysfunction of government, corruption, political corruption. They all stood out. The bad racial history. It was we all have this sense of let the good times roll in New Orleans, black, white together, parading, and that's true. It's true. I mean, but there was a lot of tensions in Party City leading up to Katrina. There's very much a black-white split, and that just got worse, I believe, with an unequal recovery.
You were there for 8 months reporting for the Times, correct? After
Correct.
Katrina. And then you subsequently left New Orleans, you left the Times, you wrote other books. What made you think, I've got to go back there and I need to write this book?
Interestingly, I was talking to fellow John Karp, well-known book editor, well-known figure in the book world, about doing a book about the rebuilding of Katrina. My thought was like everyone's paying attention to that first week. I was fascinated by the rebuilding. Like, what do you do when your city's destroyed? It's the worst disaster in modern U.S. history. 3 or 4 years ago, I kept on going to New Orleans. It's like, this recovery story isn't over yet. And that's when, I reapproached John Karp, then it's, now it's Simon & Schuster, and we both agreed that it needed a much longer timeline to tell than I appreciated, or I would say most people appreciated in New Orleans at the time.
So you moved back there?
No, I for the last 3.5 years, just every other month, I would just go down for a week, 10 days.
Last question, because of course this story does not end with the 10th anniversary remembrance or celebration. How prepared is New Orleans now for the next storm?
Well, New Orleans is much safer today than it was before Katrina. There's a $14.5 billion flood protection system that is much stronger than the one that was in place then. The fear in New Orleans is the vanishing wetlands of southern Louisiana. Every hour, this big New York Times Magazine story last year by Nathaniel Rich, my reviewer here, about the vanishing coastline of southern Louisiana. Lose a football field every hour. He had something about losing a Central Park every few days, kind of thing. And
that loss is due to?
The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers rerouted the Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And it used to be that the silt from the river replenish the wetlands. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. So the big fear in New Orleans is we have this Cadillac flood protection system. But unless there's the coastal wetlands to break the storm surge, eventually New Orleans is essentially going to be on the edge of the Gulf of Mexico. And so you need the wetlands to break the waves, to break the surge that a big hurricane would cause. So right now, New Orleans feels safe, but in a few decades, if there's not something done about the vanishing wetlands, New Orleans will be in the same position. The good news is the state legislature has come up with a $50 billion plan for taking it on. The bad news is they haven't raised most of the money. The BP oil spill threw in, $10 billion or so towards that, but there's still a lot of money to be made. So it's an open question.
An open question on the eve of the next hurricane season. All right, Gary Rivlin, thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
Gary Rivlin is the author of Katrina After the Flood, reviewed this week in the book review by Nathaniel Rich. Alexandra Alter is here with notes from the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What's going on?
Tonight, the publishing world is losing one of its staunchest allies on late-night television when Jon Stewart signs off from The Daily Show. During his 16-year run as The Daily Show host, he really showed an unusual degree of interest in books and authors, and a Daily Show appearance became one of the surest ways to get a big sales bump in this sort of post-Oprah vacuum. The media outlet Fusion crunched the numbers and did a chart showing the breakdown of Jon Stewart's guests, and it turns out that 23% of his guests were authors, which was second only to actors, who had 33% of the appearances. I think publishers really especially appreciated Jon Stewart's taste and support because he took an interest in non-mainstream books and kind of wonky nonfiction, books that aren't usually plugged on, Good Morning America or The Today Show, which tend to be more lifestyle and celebrity oriented.
It's funny, though, when you think about the bump that these TV appearances have, in that it's not consistent. I mean, I know that people used to say with Oprah, certain books, certain kinds of authors, you would go on Oprah and boom, and then others you would see almost no effect. And I think I've heard the same thing has happened with Jon Stewart's show as well.
Yeah, I think, it has to be something that's topically of interest, and maybe if the author is especially charismatic or appealing, that could help.
So the book actually matters a little bit too.
I think the book and the author do matter. I mean, a couple of examples of ones that have really taken off as a result of his support are the memoir, The Reason I Jump, which is by a Japanese boy with autism. It was published by Random House, and that really spiked after Jon Stewart promoted it. He had David Mitchell, the translator, on the show.
Who's nobody.
But that's also a subject that people, I think were interested in. A less likely one to have a huge sales bump, but one that got one, is Pound Foolish, exposing the dark side of the personal finance industry. Somebody took note of the sales effect and said it shot from number 4,600 to number 22 on Amazon after the author appeared on The Daily Show in 2013.
So who is going to be the new Oprah/Jon Stewart?
That is an excellent question. I think that's one that a lot of people in the publishing industry, authors and agents and editors are asking.
Colbert was also a major force.
Exactly. I mean, it will really be interesting to see who fills the vacuum. There's, of course, Stewart's successor, the South African comedian Trevor Noah. He seems to be engaged in politics and current events, and so people are hoping that he'll take a similar interest in authors and books on those sorts of subjects. Stephen Colbert, who is also very committed to having authors on his show, is going to become the host of The Late Show, replacing David Letterman in September. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see big authors making appearances there. Maybe your Jonathan Franzens and your Elizabeth Gilberts could be showing up on that show.
That's right. Well, he's from Montclair, which is like the Brooklyn of New Jersey in terms of literary culture.
He's probably surrounded. He's probably got authors banging on his doors asking if they can come on the show. Another candidate to become the late-night literary king is Seth Meyers, who sort of unexpectedly has taken an interest in literary fiction. He's had authors like Marlon James and Joshua Ferris and Hanya Yanagihara, as well as sort of more blockbuster-type authors like Stephen King and George R. R. Martin on his show. So he's sort of taken the role of the fiction promoter in the late-night ecosystem.
We'll have to watch our TVs to see what we should read next. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Joe Domanick joins us now. His new book is Blue, the LAPD and the Battle to Redeem American Policing. Joe, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
This book is obviously about policing, sadly timely, of course, but you've been writing about the police for a long time. Can you give a little bit of background about your reporting on policing?
I first got interested in the LAPD when I moved from New York City to Los Angeles, and I wasn't a reporter at that time. I was a teacher, and I was really struck by the difference between the NYPD circa 1974 and the LAPD. The NYPD at that time looked like they were defeated, didn't want to do the job, and would essentially be walking away from crime.
They had given up.
They had essentially given up. They were incredibly demoralized. Crime was running rampant. I was a big young guy at the time, and I was scared when I got in the subway. It was really that bad. So when I came to Los Angeles, I was really struck by the difference. The LAPD cops and the motorcycle cops, they all look like the prototype for Rambo or some kind of super cop. They were all muscular, all well tailored, and very, very aggressive, very unpolite when they were aggressive, and seemed to rule the streets. Everybody was afraid of them, including the politicians, who wouldn't dare to criticize the LAPD or the chief of police. And then when I went to the Graduate School of Journalism at USC, became a journalist, and the first piece that I did was a cover story for the LA Weekly about the LAPD entitled "Why Nobody Can Control the LAPD." And from there I got a book contract for my first book about the LAPD, Protect and to Serve.
So that was the LAPD of the 70s. Tell us a little bit about how the department changed over time.
The department didn't change over time until two events happened. The first was the beating of Rodney King, and the second was the 92 riots, which were really a protest against the acquittals of the four officers that so badly beat King. Then there was Christopher Commission report on the LAPD, and I thought it was going to be a whitewash, and it turned out not to be. It was very specific, very clear, and very telling. The report said that the LAPD was unaccountable, that there were a large group of officers who were hard-charging and essentially committed the same kind of police abuse over and over again. And it also said that Daryl Gates, the chief at that time, should resign, and it said that Mayor Tom Bradley, the long-serving and first African-American chief mayor of Los Angeles, they faulted him as well for just not doing anything about all of these problems with the LAPD. So that was the kind of the first reform of the LAPD, and it previously the chief of police of the LAPD could serve for life. There was no limit on his tenure. And Gates really took advantage of that. He served for 14 years. The modern-day godfather of the LAPD, Bill Parker, had served for 14 years. And Gates was able to Parker and Gates were able to just thumb their nose at any politician or any critic that dared to say there's something wrong here. What the Christopher Commission reforms did was they limited the tenure of the chief of police to 1 5-year term, and then they could be renewed for another 5 years. So that was good, because now you could effectively fire the chief of police after 5 years if you wanted to, and that's exactly what happened to the first two chiefs, who happened to both be African American, after the Christopher Commission reforms were put into place following the riots.
So now let's talk about William Bratton.
Bratton is the most significant police reformer and police leader of the past 25 years, and that all began really first with the New York City Transit Police, which he headed for 2 or 3 years, I think, and essentially really shook up that organization and made it a much better organization. They were the most demoralized of the demoralized. They simply weren't doing their job, and Bratton made the changes necessary to get them interested in doing their job again, and he gave them the strategy and tools to do so.
How would you characterize Bratton's approach to law enforcement?
His approach to law enforcement is, let's do what needs to be done to reduce crime. We're not any longer going to just be responders to crime. We're going to prevent crime. And he instituted a number of reforms that essentially did that. He tried them out with the subway police, and then he used them big time with the NYPD once he became commissioner. So one of them is CompStat, and this probably was his most effective reform. CompStat is the mapping of where crime is occurring on a daily basis, and then sending your cops to where that crime is being committed and stopping it through arrests, through their presence, until it's not being committed in that neighborhood anymore, and then maintaining it once crime has greatly been reduced, by making the precinct captains and the commanders responsible for doing that, for maintaining it over a long period of time, by having to report about their precincts, the progress they're making in lowering crime, or the progress they're not making in lowering crime, and holding them accountable.
Did Bratton take the strategies, the tactics that he used in New York and apply them to L.A. in the same way, or how did he adapt his approach once he moved from New York to the LAPD? Okay,
well, before I answer that question, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the reforms he initiated. Two other of his reforms were stop and frisk, mass stop and frisk, the using of mass stop and frisk, and the kind of rigid enforcement of quality of life crimes. Now, stop and frisk can be a useful tool for police in lowering crime, if it's done in the right way, which means discreetly, selectively, knowledgeably stopping somebody. But what happened under Ray Kelly, and this was inevitable because police are all about control and they're all about power. They'll take as much control and as much power as they can get. So under Ray Kelly in 2011, for example, there were 685,000 stop and frisks in New York City, 685,000. And in that same year, the number of African Americans from the ages of 14 to 24 who were stopped and frisked was more than the entire population in that age cohort of African Americans. That was a disaster for New York City, and for civil liberties and the Fourth Amendment, and it was a disaster for race relations between the NYPD and communities of color and civil liberties folks. Same was true to a lesser extent with broken windows policing, which is also a useful tool in the police arsenal that I would argue should be used on a selective basis.
Explain what broken windows is, because I think people use that term loosely and aren't sure exactly what it means.
Broken windows policing, or quality of life policing, means you enforce all of the laws, including the small laws, the minor laws that most people just feel, I'll just do this. That's not good, because if you do it too rigidly, then again you're just being a repressive police force in poor communities of color. Done properly, however, for example, if you walk out of your apartment building and to the right of you somebody's urinating on the building, to the left of you, somebody's trying to sell drugs, and you walk down the corner and there's a group of aggressive panhandlers and or prostitutes. Well, you don't want to have to deal with that. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't want to deal with it, and nobody wants to deal with it. So that's very good. Before Bratton, all that kind of stuff was just being ignored. But then that got out of hand also under Ray Kelly, and as I mentioned, it just became another repressive action by the police.
Let's move from New York to L.A. and talk a little bit about what happened when Bratton got there and how successful he was dealing with the problems in the LAPD.
Bratton was very successful in adding to the mission of the LAPD, which was previously to suppress poor people, and particularly poor people of color, and particularly the African American community. He expanded that to a second mission, which was real community policing, and in that he was very successful. And much of that is still the community policing part is still in place, and community policing has got to be the future of policing. So he did that by changing the training of the officers and giving weight to promoting them on how well they did community policing. He also freed up the captains in the various divisions to experiment and to be innovative in how they did community policing in their respective communities. And communities are very different in a city like Los Angeles and New York. So that still remains. He also reached out to a lot of grassroots folks in the African American community and politicians from that community. And he reached out to the ACLU, and he essentially said, "Look, you're not the enemy. We want to listen to you. We want to hear what you have to say. If it works for us, we'll make those changes." So I think that was very important.
Looking back at the police that you encountered when you first moved out to LA in 1974, and the way the LAPD operates now, how different is the department today?
The department is totally different in the way that they deal with middle-class people, white people. They're better in the way that they deal with poor people, but there's still problems with the way that they deal with poor people. There's been a rash of the kind of shootings where everybody would say, "What? I can't believe that happened." There's been a big rash of those recently. Bratton was a great reformer in terms of initiating really smart ways to reduce and prevent crime, and I consider that to be the first phase of police reform. The second phase is gearing up now, and it's not really coming from the police establishment. It's coming from the Black Lives Matter folks and others who are saying stop and frisk is no longer acceptable. Rigid enforcement of broken windows policing is no longer acceptable. Community policing is where we need to go. And so I think Bratton has played a large and largely positive role in reforming police departments in America, with the big exception of mass, and I underline mass, stop and frisk, which has turned out to be a disaster for New York and a terrible thing for the residents of minority communities.
Well, the subject couldn't be more timely. The book again is Blue, the LAPD and the Battle to Redeem American Policing by Joe Domanick. Joe, thank you so much for being here.
It was really my pleasure. Thank you.
Greg Cowles is here with Bestseller News. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new?
There are 3 new titles on the hardcover fiction list this week, starting down at number 14 with a book called The Bourbon Kings by J.R. Ward. Ward also writes romances as Jessica Bell, and until now, she has reserved the name J.R. Ward for paranormal novels. But this is a departure. It's not a romance or a paranormal novel. It's a contemporary family soap opera type thing about a Kentucky family that owns a bourbon company. She's said in interviews that she was thinking of Dynasty in Dallas, and that kind of family soap opera.
Can we make soap opera type thing a new genre label?
Yeah, maybe we can break it out as its own category of bestsellers. Next is not a family soap opera, but a thriller by C.J. Box, a novel called Badlands, new at number 5. Box is best known for his Joe Pickett series of thrillers, which are about a Wyoming game warden. This book is not part of that Joe Pickett series. It's a standalone novel set in North Dakota in an oil boom town. It looks at the fracking industry and kind of the drug trade that comes along with the boom town.
All right. And the next debut on the bestseller list?
Yeah, the final new book on the list this week is by Paula McLean, who's famous, of course, for The Paris Wife. This is a follow-up to that book, not a sequel, but it's the next book after The Paris Wife. It's called Circling the Sun. And it is about the aviator Beryl Markham, who flew solo across the Atlantic in 1936.
And it's amazing to see that the 1, 2, 3 from this week is the 1, 2, 3 from last week again.
Yeah, number 1, Go Set a Watchman by Harper Lee. It's number 1 for the 3rd week in a row. Number 2, The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins. And number 3, All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, which has now been on the list for 65 weeks. Still at number 3.
Wow. And what's on nonfiction new?
Nonfiction, there's only one new title. It's down all the way at the bottom of the list at number 16. It's a memoir by Sarah Hepola called Blackout. It's, as you might guess from the title, an addiction memoir. She's a young woman, and it is the story of her early addiction to alcohol.
Well, that sounds nice and cheerful. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.